My name's Heather Roberts. I'm Mavis Leon's daughter-in-law, and I'm here today to speak about a project I've been involved with called Just Kai, which is researching slavery used in the supply chain of the food that we eat here in New Zealand. Now that might sound like a strange thing to be looking into. These are practices that have been well hidden from us here in New Zealand. And when I say slavery, you might think, didn't that end centuries ago? But sadly, it didn't. It's illegal almost everywhere in the world, but still there are real slaves in the world today. People who are forced to work against their will, people who are bought and sold. This is remarkably common in our world today, but very well hidden. So I'm going to start with some bad news, telling stories that I've been learning as I've been researching this. But then I have good news as well. There are people working really hard to combat these terrible things. And there are practical ways that we can all get behind them to support them. So I'm going to start with a video which will give you some idea of what I mean by slavery. It tells the story of a young man from Myanmar called Aung Ye Tung.
Lina she at Yama. The Senelina Ima, General, Biba and Naji. I well. Macana Koya. Kodo do your two about us. Gana, Gani, Jade. I decided to go to a pole. Benamea, to know Aung Ye Tung, I don't know a year to a quarter. Bename a year modobu. Madula, Bename Sankon. Benadaga gu, Sakon Session Modo, Metadama, Nasenet on me.
And the said at him, Aguna Pura, they Lua Leo Barley, Lima said the Kairala, Copier the Carapima, Chulu and the Yankee, Elemu. Lailushi, you know, and the Yamia, Druma Lenele Pale.
Teaching on a game on a call. I now, since I got a yard losing and you know about I do you started doing a jade. I don't Adaliu who could it. See, they were not the Monazide will live. Go Panashi, the Japan Pano, I tell you, taillight. When you bend the Bialu with the Ontario, or Podo Balloon, Timona, to Timona, Unema, is Obiama Adalite in Hagalite.
So one of the changes over the last few years was to require that fishers have a bank account and get paid electronically. But some vessel owners have taken control of fishers' ATM cards.
Near the Kulo, Mulo, or Tachola, whether they are Mafia, as a low shaded, the Teria, you know, Mena Souchini, Souchini, Goa, the chair, Laura, and go Tama.
No one knows you will win or pony the lonely. Also, the roar of my Panama Johnny was that is to do a peasant be lonely. A Wallacharo, Bola, Catway, a Lidario, Panama, nothing of that same level. So, Mola Apiani, but to do Ganway, see Shinjare. I don't see it. You have to go to low channel, you take over she.
Nabe Yang and Nonapomaso, Tayama, do Yotayama, Coneselawa di Gilongama Piano. Pajala Road, 2 di long and a 20 anyway.
ရွှေရင်းလုံးကအန်ဒီလည်းများတယ်ကျွင်းနေစိမ့်ပြီးဆိုကိုတတ်တော့ကိုမိုင်တော့လေကျွန်တော်စိတ်ထဲအမှန်ပြောမယ်နော်ကျွန်တော်ရွှေရင်းကိုတတ်လုံးဆိုကျွန်တော်လုပ်မယ်ပြင်လေတော့ကျွန်တော်တစ်နှစ်ပြန်မသွားတော့ဟိုငရဲပြီဆိုတာဘာမှမသိမဲ့လောလောဆယ်လောကငရဲအဲ့ဒါပဲငရဲပြီတကယ်ခံစားခြင်းတဲ့လူအင်ဒိုဒါရှိတရားမဝင်လေပေါ့နော်အဲပစိုးပန်ပါလေအဲ့လိုခိုးဆွဲကလေးတာလိုက်သွားပါလို့အဲ့လိုငရဲပြီကိုကျင်းနေပါတွေ့လိမ့်မယ်ကဲလို့ပေါ့နော်ဟိုကျွန်တော်တို့အသက်ရှင်ပြန်လာတဲ့လူတွေရဲ့လောက်အားကားကိုပေါ့နော်မရတာကိစ္စမရှိဘူးဒီကတီးပြီးတည့်ရတိုင်းမလုပ်တာတော့အဲ့ဒါတော့ဟိုလူရှိုးနေမကောက်တာမသိကြအောင်ဆောင်းလိုက်တာပဲပေါ့ဟုတ်လား
The Thai government and the industry here has been under a lot of pressure over the last 4 or 5 years. They've made some progress, and it's now important that other industries in the neighborhood, Indonesia, Vietnam, India, that have problems that are similar, be made to raise their game.
So the International Labour Organization reckons there are more than 40 million people in situations like Aung Ye Tung's in the world today. That's 8 times the population of New Zealand, about the same as the population of Canada. People are not always sold, like Aung Ye Tung was, but they're always working against their will and unable to leave. Sometimes they're paid, although he wasn't, but they're always confined. And honestly, on a fishing boat, it's easy to confine someone. You're already out at sea. But there's also people confined with threats of violence. We saw men in the video where there was a guy who had a gun to their heads, or they take people's documents, things like that. There's 40 million people, what do? There are 5 million people estimated to work in the sex trade, and if you've heard about slavery, that's the part you've most likely heard about. There's also 15 million people thought to have been forced marriages, so marriages against their will, but 20 million of them are doing very ordinary jobs. Some of those are in domestic service or construction, but nearly 8 million of those people are working in the mining industry, perhaps mining the minerals that go into your cell phone, working on fishing boats, working in agriculture, like in the cocoa plantations, and working in the production in factories, basically making physical goods for sale. And I'm particularly interested in those people, the 7.8 million people who are making physical objects, because those products are hidden in amongst the goods that we buy in ordinary shops here in New Zealand. It's kind of shocking to think that things like we saw in that video have happened in the production of things we buy. But it's also an opportunity, because we're the customer. If we choose to buy stuff that's reliably slave-free, then that whole market will wither away, and that kind of practice will need to stop. So in terms of what those people are doing, the thing that that we buy that's at the highest risk of having slavery in its supply chain is electronics, cell phones and laptops and so on, followed by clothing, and then fish, cocoa and sugar. When I first started looking into this, there were people already doing electronics and clothing. And in particular, when it comes to clothing, we've got a table out the back, and I've got a little booklet on there, if you're interested, put out by another organisation, Tier Fund, which ranks most of the main clothing brands sold in New Zealand in terms of human rights. So others are already doing electronics and clothing, so I took on the food, the fish, the cocoa and the sugar. And I've been emailing companies and brands asking if they can guarantee that their whole supply chain is free of child labour and slave labour, right back to the original fishing boat or the original farm. And I'm not interested in promises or guesses. I want to know, is someone actually checking what's actually going on? So I'm going to talk about the issues that I've learned about in each of these industries, in the fish, cocoa and sugar industries, and then talk about some of the solutions, how we can help with that. There should be a few minutes at the end for questions. Also, many of you will have seen Martin and I have a table in the hall out the back, and you can come and talk to us there as well. So we'll start with the fishing industry. So we've already heard a bit about this from the video. I personally first started learning about this about 4 years ago. There was a bunch of reports that came out in the New Zealand media. Some of you may have seen these as well. They were focusing particularly on the tuna industry. And we were hearing that men from low-income countries like Cambodia and Thailand were being tricked into working on fishing boats. Someone would come to their village and they would say, hey, do you want to come? I've got a good job that's in a factory in the city, or perhaps a good job that's on a fishing boat that goes out and back every day, and it pays an awful lot more than what you're earning here on your farm. So they'd go off with that person to a far city, and when they arrived, they'd find that it wasn't like that at all. They'd be trapped for months or even years on a fishing boat. And if that sounds crazy, there's this practice called transshipping, where a fishing boat will go out to sea somewhere far away, particularly looking for things like tuna, and it will just stay there for 3 months to 4 years. And every few months, another boat will come out to that boat, drop off supplies, pick up the fish, take it back, but the men stay on that boat. And if the conditions there are bad, they can't get away. These men are paid very little, often nothing at all. We heard in the video about the man saying he was only allowed to sleep for half an hour a day. They're given drugs to make that possible. You can't do that ordinarily. Rape is common, as is murder. I read a study of Cambodian men who had been on Thai fishing boats, and 2/3 of them said that they personally had seen a colleague killed. These practices happen in many parts of the world. We've heard a lot about Thailand, where things are particularly bad, or possibly particularly well looked at, to be honest. But they reckon about 17% of workers there are slaves on the boats. But I've recently also heard terrible reports from Korea and from China. And it also happens in our region, in the South Pacific, and literally here in New Zealand. In 2018, there was a company who was convicted. I think they were fishing for squid, and they hadn't paid their workers a cent for 2 years here in New Zealand. Slavery has been documented in many parts of the fishing industry, but it's particularly at risk where people go out for a long time. So with a tuna boat, tuna is a deep water fish, it's a long way away from land. It's particularly at risk. Similarly, squid is deep water, so the boats are out a long time. And there's also what they call trash fish, which is scrappy fish that goes into fish oil supplements, into pet food, things like that. And again, that's at particular risk. The other place of concern is factories. Slave labour and child labour have been well documented at fish processing factories in many places. And that's particularly significant in New Zealand because we have literally no canneries for human consumption fish in New Zealand. So if you're buying tinned fish, it was tinned overseas. So that's just an overview of fishing. Cocoa. Cocoa is what I actually first started learning about. It's the next highest risk of slave labour, but also a huge issue in cocoa is child labour. About 20% of all the cocoa produced in the world is produced by children. And when you first hear about child labour, I often have people say to me, well, that's not so bad. And I had a paper run when I was 11. I worked in a dairy all through high school. I'm sure many of you had jobs like that when you were young as well. But that's not the kind of work I'm talking about. These children are working full-time, so they don't get an education. They generally start from the age of 12, but they can start as young as 8, and it's very hazardous work. We can go to the next slide with the pictures. Yeah, so here are 2 kids working in the cocoa industry. The 2 boys on the left, you'll see have got big, long knives. And long knives like that are used for splitting open cocoa pods and also for cutting down the cocoa pods from the trees. And pretty much any child who works in the cocoa industry has substantial scars from those knives. They're very sharp and heavy. And then the child on the right has got a great big basket on his head full of cocoa pods. Cocoa pods are surprisingly heavy. A load like that could be as much as 50 kilos. And again, these are children as young as 12. And they often get quite bad spinal damage, which interferes with their growth from carrying big loads like that. It's estimated between 1.6 and 2.1 million kids are doing this kind of work, mostly in West Africa. And generally they're working for their parents on their own family farm. There's not much money in the cocoa industry, and often the parents have to pull their kids out of school to do the work. But there's also about 30,000 people thought to be actual slaves. And then on to sugar. So this is the next highest risk area. It's the one that I've learnt the least about. It's the thing that's newest to me. But again, child and slave labour seem to be very common in sugar, particularly in Brazil. And that's significant because Brazil is the world's largest exporter. Another significant issue with sugar is illegal land use. We saw the passage from Job about taking over other people's farms and farming their land that Ian shared. And that happens in the world today, particularly in Latin America. There'll be smallholder farmers doing subsistence farming, growing their own crops for their own food. And a big sugar company will come in and be like, this is a nice area, and we'll simply plant it up in sugarcane. And those people starve. And these are big issues for New Zealand in particular, because a lot of people think a lot of our sugar comes from Australia, but we import sugar from all over the world, including places like Brazil. So these are terrible stories. And as I've pondered them, I've often come back to a story I learned as a child, a story I'm sure most of you know well, the story Jesus told of the Good Samaritan. A lawyer comes to Jesus and says, who is my neighbour? He knows he has to love his neighbour as himself to get into heaven, but he wants to kind of know what are the limits on what he has to do. So he's like, who is my neighbour? And Jesus tells him a story, that there was a man going along a lonely road who's beaten up and left for dead. Two different religious leaders come by, see him, ignore him and walk on by. And then the Samaritan comes, sees him, and goes well above and beyond to help him out. And Jesus turns the question back. Who was a neighbour to the man? And the obvious answer is the one who helped him. And I've always taken from that Jesus calls us to help anyone we come across who needs our help. Anyone who needs our help, they are our neighbour. And I came to understand that whenever I ate fish, cocoa or sugar, in a way I was encountering the people who made those things. They're far away, but I'm connected to them through the things that they are making for me. And many of those people badly needed my help. What can I do to help them? And that is where I have good news. I've been analysing certifications and contacting companies, asking questions, looking for products where someone has made sure that there's no child labour, no slave labour, right back to the original boat or farm. And almost everywhere I've looked, I've found brands and companies going to extraordinary lengths to make sure that their whole supply chain is slave-free. And if we all get behind these brands and support them, we're part of the solution. The business for those good companies will expand, they can hire more people, and the slavery business model will just not work anymore. So, how can you know? When you arrived, you will have got a flyer with a diagram of many different logos and brands, which are the good ones that you should be looking for. Any of the things that you see on that, if you see any of the logos on that flyer, you can be confident someone's really checked to make sure there was no slave labour or no child labour. With other ones, I often don't know, because it's not like the companies in New Zealand personally are hiring slaves. They only know they're buying from people far away, and they need to check what the people far away are doing. Otherwise, they themselves have no idea if they're using slave-produced cocoa or sugar themselves. I've got a lot more detailed information on my website, which the address is of on the flyer. There's also a table in the hall that has examples of the good products we're recommending and has hard copies of much more detailed buying guides for different areas. I'm going to talk about some recommendations in more detail for cocoa and sugar first, as that's much more straightforward, and then talk about fish. So on to cocoa. There's 3 certifications I recommend you look for. The 2 at the top, the different versions of fair trade. The leftmost one you've probably seen more of. It's very widely used, but both of those are very reliable. And the bottom one, the kind of maroon UTZ one, that's not so well known, and it's also a bit complicated because it's currently in transition. It's over the next year or so, starting from September, is going to be replaced by the green frog on the right instead. But if you see, again, either of those two logos, you'll know that there's been no child labour and no slave labour. And the UTZ one is currently on many of Countdown's own brand cocoa products, and also on Kit Kats and Milo, and Whittaker's is in the process of transitioning to using it for all of their, or almost all of their chocolate as well. I've got a comprehensive list of everything I know of in New Zealand that has one of those certifications, and that's on the website. There's also hard copies on the table. And it's not just chocolate, it's got ice cream, it's got cosmetics that have cocoa in, it's got chocolate milk, almost anything you can think of except chocolate biscuits. Nobody is doing chocolate biscuits. But other than that, most cocoa things you'll find a good option, often for actually no more than an equivalent non-fair trade option. So that's cocoa. Onto sugar. Either of the two fair trade logos are again very reliable and again used for sugar. But to be honest, sugar with those on is quite hard to find. You often have to go to specialty shops, and it's also quite expensive. So if you can find it, that's excellent. But your easiest option, if we just stay on the sugar slide, please. Your easiest option for sugar is Countdown own brand sugar. It's got the Bon Sucro logo on that, which is an independent certification checking for slave and child labour. And if you're looking for things with sugar in them rather than actual sugar, you can also look for product of Australia, which means the sugar was grown in Australia. And again, Countdown is a good option for that. Their jelly crystals and their sweetened condensed milk and many other products have Australian sugar in them. And that takes us to fish, which is more complicated. There aren't any certifications I can tell you to look for, but I have been contacting companies and found that many of them are still checking well. I've got a lot of detail in this area, but I want to highlight two things in particular. Firstly, your easiest option for buying fish is to buy from Sealord. They've got a wide range, so many of the things you're looking for they will sell, and I'm very confident that anything they sell, they've checked for child and slave labour on the boats. And in particular, if you want to buy tinned tuna for your sandwiches or anything, they are your only option. They're the only company I know of that audits what happens on tuna boats. Secondly, I want to mention pet food. If you've got a cat or a dog, chances are they're eating fish. You might be buying a beef-flavoured brand or something, but if you look at the ingredients list, fish is in basically all dry cat food and quite a lot of other pet food as well, even if it's not obvious. And for pet food, it's complicated. They use this trash fish that's kind of scraps left over from things. It's cheap fish. It can be often quite hard for a company to know quite what happened because there's been like 5 other companies between when it was fished and when they've bought it. But with that in mind, Purina is doing excellent work making sure that their whole supply chain is slave-free. Other than that, I've got buying guides on the table out the back for tinned fish, salmon, pet food, and fish oil supplements, if you take omega-3 supplements, anything like that. I've also nearly finished a new guide on shellfish, crustaceans, so prawns and things, and squid. So there's hard copies of the existing ones out the back. If you are on the internet, if you keep an eye on our website or our Facebook page, you can be alerted when the new one comes out on prawns and so on. So that's most of what I have to say. In conclusion, I just want to take a moment to honour the people making this work possible. There are terrible things happening in our food production, where people are trying to hide, but there's other people trying very hard to reveal it. So Ian Urbina on the left here is an American journalist who spent the last 10 years researching and reporting conditions on fishing boats. A lot of the information I have comes from him. And then the gentleman on the right, Andy Hall, is an activist from the UK who's lived in Thailand for many years. And he's particularly been focusing on factories that process both fish and fruit, and has been responsible for improving the conditions in many factories, including one of the factories that Sealord is now using. There's also a small group of people, often from poor countries themselves, who work as observers on fishing boats, checking for illegal practices. And it's very dangerous work, and I particularly want to honour today this man here, Eritara Kaiarua from Kiribati. He was found dead in March this year on the tuna boat where he was working, and it's believed that he saw stuff that was going on that oughtn't to have been happening and was killed so he couldn't report it. And this happens a couple of times a year. There's terrible things happening behind the food we buy, but there are also people working very hard to stop it. And as we shop, let's support the work that these people are doing so that this evil can be stopped. Thank you.